Cowan Creek, Sydney, the Bobbin Head slipway. Oregon planking catching the afternoon sun, 6 cousins on the aft deck of a 36-foot Halvorsen. The father at the wooden wheel, the mother in the teak galley. 7 knots up the Hawkesbury towards Baravra waters. Silky varnish. Copper rivets. The Halvorsen holiday, 1958, 1,299 boats. 11 Fairmiles that hunted Japanese submarines from Darwin to Milne Bay. 8 polished pleasure cruisers that sank a Japanese midget submarine in Sydney Harbour. A wooden yacht called Freya that won 3 consecutive Sydney to Hobarts. The greatest wooden boat empire in the Southern Hemisphere. Then in the 1970s, an American plastic hull moulded in Melbourne killed it. Not with a bang, with a silence. Norway to Cape Town to Sydney. A shipwright's son, a sunken trading vessel, a family that walked away from its own empire. How does a wooden dynasty die? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The sinking of the Nidalv, southern Norway. The town of Helle, near Arendal, on the Skagerrak coast. Lars Halvorsen, born 1887, a rising shipbuilder trained by his father Halvor Andersen, in a boat-building tradition that reached back to the 1880s, owns a trading vessel called the Nidalv. Arendal was a town of shipwrights, Norwegian southern coast, timber, copper, hemp, sail. Lars had learned the trade from his father, who had built his first wooden craft near Arendal decades earlier. The Andersen-Halvorsen boat-building line went back 3 generations. Every voyage Lars Halvorsen ever ran he insured. Every voyage but one. The Nidalv sails into the North Sea in the years after the First World War with an uninsured cargo. She never comes back. The Halvorsen fortune sinks with her. Post-war Norway is not a country a shipbuilder wants to lose his shirt in. Lars is in his early 30s with a wife, Birgitta, and 7 children under 15. 5 sons, 2 daughters. Harold, born 1910. Carl, born 1912. Bjarne. Trygve, born 1920. Magnus, born 18th of August 1918. Plus daughters Elnor and Margit. He needs to start again. Somewhere else, somewhere warmer, somewhere with an empire that still buys wooden pleasure boats. 1922. Lars, 35 years old, packs his wife and 7 children onto a steamer and sails for Cape Town, South Africa. He builds boats in Cape Town for 2 years, yachts admired by the Royal Cape Town Yacht Club. But Cape Town is a small market for a family of 9, and the British Empire has a bigger dominion 12,000 miles southeast. Late 1924. Lars and his eldest son Harold, 14 years old, apprenticed to his father since the age of 10, board the sailing ship SS Mozart. They sail from Cape Town to Adelaide. They land in Australia around Christmas Day 1924. Birgitta and the remaining 6 children arrive on a follow-on ship on the 16th of February 1925. They rent a boatshed at Drummonai on the Parramatta River in Sydney's inner west. Lars builds his first Australian boat, a yacht. He calls her Sirius. The Halvorsen Empire had begun. Chapter 2. Ryde, 1925 to 1939. 14 years of Sydney apprenticeship. The family moves through boatsheds like a shipwright working through a stack of Oregon. Drummoyne, then Careening Cove, 1926. Then Lloyd's Yard at Neutral Bay in 1927, on the former site of Ben Boyd's colonial wool store from the 1840s. Extended shed built 1935. The five sons apprentice into the firm at 14. Carl in 1927. Bjarne in 1930. Magnus in 1932. Trygve in 1934. The boats are built to Norwegian standards. Double diagonal planking, copper rivets. Oregon above the waterline. Spotted gum below. Then, the tragedy that shapes everything that comes next. The 5th of October, 1936. Lars Halvorsen, 49 years old, at the peak of his powers, dies of osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone, an illness treatable a few years later with penicillin, not treatable in 1936, weeks before the launch of Silver Arrow, completed 31st of October 1936. The last boat Lars ever designed. He never saw her in the water. The family had been in Australia 12 years. Lars had built the Halvorsen name from a rented boatshed at Drummoyne to a growing yard at Neutral Bay. He was survived by Birgitta, 5 sons, 2 daughters, and a workshop full of Norwegian shipwrights he had personally trained. Harald Halvorsen, 26 years old, born in Norway, apprenticed since he was 10, becomes managing director of Lars Halvorsen Sons Proprietary Limited. He will run the firm for the next 64 years. 1939. War in Europe. War coming to the Pacific. The Halvorsens buy 5 acres on Waterview Street, Ryde and Putney, the former James Squire Colonial Brewery wharf, on the Parramatta River, upstream from the harbour. 5 slipways. Craft up to 90 feet, 100 tonnes on the biggest slipway. Engineering shop, blacksmith shop, lumber shop, machine shop, plumbing shop, sheet metal shop. By 1940, Ryde is the largest wooden boatyard in Australia, and it was about to build the boats that defended Sydney. Chapter 3. The Fairmiles, the 5th of January, 1942. 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, 5 weeks after the fall of Malaya. The Australian War Cabinet in Canberra approves construction of Fairmile B-class motor launchers for the Royal Australian Navy. The specification, 112 feet long. Wooden hull, double diagonal Oregon planking on Queensland maple frames. Twin Hall-Scott petrol engines. 20 knots. 2-pounder gun forward, 20mm Oerlikon aft. Twin .303 machine guns, depth charges, crew of 16. The design is by W. J. Holt of the British Admiralty. Between 1942 and 1945, Halvorsen at Ryde builds 11 Fairmiles for the Royal Australian Navy. 11. Not 16, not 250. The 250 figure, you see it in Halvorsen family literature, is the total wartime output at Ryde. 247 craft, according to Harold Halvorsen's Order of Australia Medal citation. Fairmiles, plus air-sea rescue boats, plus supply boats, plus target towing craft. 11 were Fairmiles. Named boats: ML841, ML851, ML89, ML824. Named commanders: Lieutenant Rollo A. E. Moore, ML819. Lieutenant Gilbert R. Kennedy, ML814. Lieutenant Charles A. J. Inman, ML815. Lieutenant F. P. Wallace, ML824. Over 350 tradesmen at Ryde, at the peak of wartime production. Norwegian shipwrights, Australian carpenters, copper apprentices, boys as young as 14 taken on as first-year apprentices under the wartime manpower regulations, working 2 shifts a day, 6 days a week, for 4 years. 178 air-sea rescue craft, 38-foot boats, 62-foot supply boats. The Fairmile construction process was staggering. Each hull required thousands of board feet of Oregon and Queensland maple. The double diagonal planking method, 2 layers of thin planks laid at 90 degrees to each other with a canvas and glue membrane between, gave the hulls extraordinary strength for their weight. Months of hand labour per hull. The Halvorsen Fairmiles ran Operation Mosquito in 1943, the clandestine supply run to Japanese-held Timor. They hunted Japanese submarines from Darwin to Milne Bay to the Coral Sea. ML-819 was involved in one of the war's tragic friendly fire losses in New Guinea waters. But the Halvorsen wartime story that outlives all of that happened in Sydney Harbour, in one night, in May and June 1942, and the boats that fought it were not Fairmiles, they were pleasure cruisers. Chapter 4. The Hollywood Fleet and Taylor's Bay. May 1942. The Royal Australian Navy commissions 8 Halvorsen luxury pleasure cruisers as Channel patrol boats to defend Sydney Harbour. The press nicknames them the Hollywood Fleet because they are polished mahogany, antique weekend boats with 2-pounder oerlikons bolted on top. Named boats: Penelope, Miramar, Nereus, Sea Mist, Silver Cloud, Steady Hour, To Mary, Winbar. Each of these boats had been built by Halvorsen at Neutral Bay in the 1930s or early 40s for wealthy Sydney owners. Weekend cruising boats: Pittwater, Broken Bar, Sunday afternoon runs to Manly. In early 1942, with the Japanese advance across the Pacific accelerating and Sydney's coastal defence stretched thin, the Navy requisitioned them, painted them grey and mounted machine guns on the wheelhouses. Steady Hour, 56 feet, was built by Halvorsen at Neutral Bay in 1940 for Sydney businessman Fred Harris, requisitioned by the Navy in early 1942. Commanded by Lieutenant Athol Townley, later the Federal Minister for Air, Immigration and Defence in the Menzies Cabinet. Sea Mist, commanded by Lieutenant Reginald Andrew. The night of the 31st of May, 1942. 3 Japanese Type A midget submarines penetrate Sydney Harbour, launched from parent submarines 7 miles offshore. Their mission: attack the Allied warships anchored at Garden Island and Farm Cove. The Type A midget submarine had been developed by the Imperial Japanese Navy in the late 1930s. 2-man crew, 2 18-inch torpedoes. Sydney Harbour was one of the deepest, most defended natural harbours in the Southern Hemisphere. The Japanese command believed the American cruiser fleet, including USS Chicago, was anchored inside. Midget No. 1 becomes tangled in the anti-submarine boom net, scuttled by her own crew. Midget No. 2, commanded by Lieutenant Kenshi Chuma, fires 2 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser USS Chicago. Both miss. One hits the harbour boat HMAS Kutabul at Garden Island. 21 Australian and British sailors killed. Midget No. 3, commanded by Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban, is spotted by the Channel patrol boats before dawn on the 1st of June, in Taylor's Bay, on the north shore of the harbour. Steady Hour, Sea Mist and HMAS Yaroma close in. Lieutenant Athol Townley, commanding Steady Hour, orders Lieutenant Reginald Andrew of Sea Mist to set his depth charges for 15 metres. Sea Mist drops the disabling charge. Read that again. The last Japanese midget submarine to attack Sydney Harbour was destroyed in Taylor's Bay by a Halvorsen pleasure cruiser built for weekend cruising on Pittwater. The Hollywood Fleet, the polished mahogany, the teak trim, the 2-pounder oerlikons bolted on top. Credit for the sinking was initially misattributed to Steady Hour and Yaroma. Subsequent naval investigation identified Sea Mist as the boat whose charges destroyed the submarine. Halvorsen wooden boats had sunk a Japanese submarine in Sydney Harbour. The war ended 3 years later. The Fairmile contracts stopped. The Hollywood Fleet went back to weekend cruising. And Harold Halvorsen, 35 years old, walked into his office at Ryde in November 1945 with 350 tradesmen and no orders. Chapter 5. Bobbin Head, late 1945, the war economy shutting down. Harold Halvorsen faces the same problem every Australian wartime manufacturer faces. No more Fairmile contracts, no more air-sea rescue craft, no more government checks, 350 shipwrights on the payroll, 0 orders in the book. The answer is Bobbin Head. Late 1945, the family acquires a boatshed on Cowan Creek in Ku-ring-gai Chase, 25 kilometres north of the Sydney CBD. The shed itself had been built in 1937. A boatshed had stood on the site since the 1890s. Ku-ring-gai Chase had been proclaimed a public reserve in 1894. Australia's second oldest national park after Royal National Park south of Sydney. Cowan Creek was the deepest tidal arm of the Hawkesbury system. Sheltered water, sandstone cliffs, Angophora forest on the ridges, sea eagles overhead. The perfect anchorage for a hire fleet. The boatshed the Halvorsens took over sat directly on the tide line, with a slipway running up into the timber shed, and a jetty running out into Cowan Creek. By Christmas 1945, 50 rowing skiffs and 50 18-foot open launches are on the water. Early 1946, the first purpose-built Halvorsen hire cruiser, a 25-footer, Morris Vedette engine. The hire fleet is born. Then comes the boat that defines everything. July 1948. The first Halvorsen 36-foot standard cruiser is launched at Ryde and delivered to Bobbin Head. Oregon, Douglas fir above the waterline, spotted gum below, hardwood and Queensland maple frames, teak and mahogany interior, French polished, wooden wheel, brass fittings, 6 berths, a galley with a kerosene stove. The standard cruiser design was Trigva's. Full displacement hull, sedate 7-knot cruising speed, shallow draft for the Hawkesbury creeks. She was the boat every ordinary Sydney family could learn to handle in a single afternoon, simple controls, forgiving in a chop, roomy enough for 6 adults or 12 people camping on the aft deck. And built to last 30 years of hard hire fleet weekend abuse. 10 36-footers in the hire fleet by the mid-50s, then 21-footers, 11 built between 1948 and 1950, 25-footers, 26-footers. April 1957, Taronga, the first 36-footer in the fleet. Enterprise 1957, Endeavour, 38 feet, March 1970, the fleet flagship. And the boat that outlives them all, Kangaroo. 36 feet, November 1958, job number 1127. The only original Halvorsen hire boat still charterable in Sydney today, 67 years old and still going. She played the boat named the Blacksland in the television series Home and Away. Chapter 6. The Halvorsen Holiday. By the mid-1960s, Halvorsen operates the largest privately owned pleasure fleet in the Southern Hemisphere, 63 motor cruisers at peak, plus rowing skiffs, plus small launches, roughly 200 boats in total across Bobbin Head. The Halvorsen Holiday Brochure of 1962, verbatim. Escape to unspoilt bays and foreshores. Every day will bring new adventures. It's all yours in any amount on your Halvorsen holiday. Thousands of ordinary Sydney families book a week on the Hawkesbury or Cowan Creek. School teachers, tradesmen, bank clerks, council engineers, post office workers. They arrive at Bobbin Head on a Friday afternoon in a Holden station wagon loaded with sleeping bags and cricket bats. They board the 36-footer. 6 cousins on the aft deck. The father, never having steered a boat in his life, nervously takes the wooden wheel. By Saturday morning, they are chugging up Cowan Creek at 7 knots. The Oregon planking humming in the afternoon sun. The teak galley below. The kerosene stove hissing. The cousins in bathers on the foredeck. The mother frying eggs and bacon. the father teaching himself navigation from the Halvorsen chart book. By Sunday afternoon, they are anchored in Refuge Bay, or Cottage Point, or America Bay, or Jerusalem Bay. By Tuesday, they are at Baravra Waters. By Friday afternoon, they are back at Bobbin Head, sunburnt, exhausted, and already booking next year. This is the Halvorsen memory that lives in Sydney to this day. The booking process itself was a ritual. Sydney families would ring the Halvorsen office at Bobbin Head months ahead to reserve a boat for the following January. The best boats, Kangaroo, Taronga, Enterprise, were reserved a full year in advance. Regular families booked the same week, the same boat, every year for a generation. Some fathers taught their sons to steer on the same wooden wheel their own fathers had first held. Every wooden Halvorsen you see on Sydney Harbour today has a name and a family, and 6 cousins attached to it. Chapter 7. Freya. Meanwhile, Trygve Halvorsen, the youngest son, the designer, born 1920 in Norway, brought to Sydney at 4, was drawing yachts at his desk at Ryde. His racing designs came in sequence. Enterprise in 1934, restored 1945. Saga in 1946, Peer Gynt in 1947, Solveig in 1950, Anitrafaf in 1956, Norla in 1960. Each design won something. Solveig won the 1954 Sydney to Hobart. Anitrafaf won the 1957 Sydney to Hobart. Between 1948 and 1961, the Halvorsen brothers won 4 Trans-Tasman races on Peer, Gynt, Solveig and Norla. In total, over the 2 decades between the mid-1940s and the mid-1960s, the Halvorsen brothers won 5 Sydney to Hobarts on handicap and had 5 second placings. No other family in Australian offshore sailing has matched that record. By 1962, Trygve had a new design on the drawing board, a 38'9" double-ender, Douglas fir planking on glued spline over laminated Queensland maple frames, fibreglassed plywood deck-stepped aluminium mast. Trygve had drawn her with a short keel and a spade rudder. Magnus, the navigator, the older brother, the man who had taught himself celestial navigation from a book bought at a Honolulu ship chandlery in 1959, asked Trygve to redraw. Change the short keel to a long keel with a keel-hung rudder. Easier steering. Better on the long ocean crossings. Trygve redrew. Launched 1963, she was named Freya, after the Norse goddess of love, beauty and fertility. Boxing Day 1963. Sydney to Hobart. Freya wins on handicap. Sailed by joint skippers Trygve and Magnus Halvorsen, with Trevor Garland as the third helmsman. Boxing Day 1964. Sydney to Hobart. Freya wins on handicap again. Boxing Day 1965. Sydney to Hobart. Freya wins on handicap for the 3rd year in a row. The Cruising Yacht Club of Australia on the record, verbatim, Freya is still the only yacht to have delivered 3 successive Sydney to Hobart wins on handicap in 1963, 1964 and 1965. 62 years later, the record is unmatched. Magnus Halvorsen quoted in the Cruising Yacht Club archive, her long deadwood gave her the underwater body of a contemporary 50 to 55 footer. Never did she broach to. Today's sailors would find that unbelievable. Magnus and Trygve shared the 1965 to 66 Umpole Australian Yachtsman of the Year award. That same year, 1965, Freya is part of Australia's first Admiral's Cup team, sailing in the UK. The team came 2nd overall against the world's best. 3 years earlier, in 1962, the same Ryde yard had built Gretel, designed by Alan Payne for Sir Frank Packer. Australia's first America's Cup challenger. Trygve and Magnus both crewed. Trevor Gowland, the apprentice shipwright who had joined Halvorsen at 14, was the foreman shipwright and sail trimmer. Off Newport, Rhode Island, watched by President John F. Kennedy on the opening race, Gretel won race 2 of the Cup match against Weatherly, the first non-American yacht to win an America's Cup race in generations. The Halvorsens were now simultaneously running the biggest wooden hire fleet in the Southern Hemisphere, holding the Sydney to Hobart record, and building America's Cup challenges. 1965 was the peak of the Halvorsen Empire. Chapter 8. The Bertram 31. New York City, February 1961. The New York National Boat Show at the New York Coliseum on Columbus Circle. On a display floor between the Chris Craft stand and the Hatteras stand, an American company called Bertram Yacht unveils a new model, the Bertram 31, nicknamed the Glass Moppy. Fibreglass hull, deep V planing bottom, base price $15,900 United States dollars. Ray Green had built the first glass-reinforced polyester boat hull back in 1942. The material was already 20 years old. But 1961 was the year it went mainstream. The Bertram 31 was designed by naval architect Ray Hunt. Deep V planing hull, twin engine configuration. Around 1,860 Bertram 31s would be built over the next 16 years. 1963. Bertram licenses Australian production. Bertram Australia opens a moulding plant in Victoria. The company later spins off as Caribbean. Savage copies Bertram lines. Every Sydney boat show from 1965 onwards features more fiberglass hulls than wood. Here's the kicker. A wooden Halvorsen 36 takes 6 months to build, requires 40 tradesmen working through the season, 2,000 board feet of imported Oregon and Australian spotted gum. Sells for around $20,000 in 1965 money. A fiberglass Bertram 31 comes out of a mould in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the labour for the same price. The Bertram has no rot, no caulking, no annual paint job, no French polishing. Read that again. The economics of building a wooden pleasure boat in Australia ended in 1963. It just took another 13 years for Halvorsen to admit it. 1967. Trygve and Magnus Halvorsen and Trevor Gowland form a new company, Halvorsen, Mawson and Gowland, HMG, with Jim and Jock Mawson. Steel, fiberglass, aluminium. Around 75 boats built at a Sydney yard over the next 12 years, named HMG boats, Ballyhoo, Ginkgo, Apollo 2. Alan Bond's 1974 America's Cup Challenger, Southern Cross. But the wooden Ryde yard soldiered on, selling wooden 36-footers to buyers who wanted mahogany and teak, not moulded polyester. The market for those buyers was shrinking every year. Chapter 9. Hong Kong, 1975, Sydney. Harvey Halvorsen, Harold's son, the third-generation shipwright, designer of Silver Cloud II and later of Emma, makes a call. He and his uncle Trygve pack up and move to Hong Kong. They form Kong and Halvorsen in a former shipyard in Hong Kong's new territories. They build fiberglass cruisers called the Island Gypsy. Mass moulded, Chinese labour costs, sold internationally, distributed from California to Fort Lauderdale to Sydney. The Halvorsen name now lives but in Asia, not Australia. 20th of June 1976. Ryde, the 90-foot motor yacht Emma slides down the No. 1 slipway into the Parramatta River. Twin 2,700 horsepower MTU V12 engines. Australia's first super yacht, built for Sydney tobacco. Figure Arthur Nelson. She was the last great wooden Halvorsen ever built at Ryde. Trygve, Magnus, Harvey, Trevor Gowland, the last remaining shipwrights from the wartime Fairmiles team, gathered at the slipway. 51 years after Lars Halvorsen rented that first boatshed at Drummoyne. 40 years after Lars died of osteomyelitis in October 1936. 34 years after the first Halvorsen Fairmile hit the water at Ryde in April 1942. Emma was the last of the line. The Ryde yard limped on for 4 more years. Repairs, small commissions, occasional new builds. But the order book was thin. 1980, the Ryde yard is sold to the Royal Australian Navy. Becomes the Naval Refit Centre. Where Halvorsen apprentices had learned to plank in double diagonal Oregon, RAN engineers now serviced attack-class patrol boats. The largest wooden boatyard in Australia was now a Navy service depot. The wooden shipwright trade in Australia, the Norwegian-imported, Sydney-apprenticed, Ryde-graduated tradition that Lars had brought over on the SS Mozart in 1924, began to die that year. Chapter 10. The Silence at Bobbin Head. But Bobbin Head kept going. For 23 more years after Ryde closed, the hire fleet at Cowan Creek kept operating. Kangaroo, Taronga, Enterprise, Endeavour. 63 motor cruisers cycling through Sydney, families every summer. Harold Halvorsen, 90 years old, awarded the Order of Australia Medal in the year 2000 for his 247 wartime craft, was still walking the Bobbin Head slipway in April 2000. He died at home in November 2000, 90 years old, 64 years as Managing Director of Lars Halvorsen Sons. The Sydney Morning Herald ran a substantial obituary on the 2nd of December 2000. Under a photograph of Harold at the wheel of a wooden cruiser, the paper called him the last of the great wooden boat builders. Carl Halvorsen died in 2014, one day short of his 102nd birthday. He had been made a Knight, First Class of the Royal Norwegian Order of Merit by King Harald V in 1991. Carl had won the 5.5-metre Australian Sailing Championship 3 times, in 1967, 1982 and 1991, still racing at 93. Trygve Halvorsen died in November 2014. 94 years old, designer of Freya, Solveig, Anitra the Fav, Norla and the Gretel modifications. He had retired from ocean racing after Freya's 3rd Hobart win in 1965 and had spent the following decades designing cruisers and sailing dinghies. Magnus Halvorsen died in 2015, just short of 97. Navigator of the 3 Hobart Triple. He had continued sailing into his 80s and had navigated Kealoha 2 to a Sydney Hobart Line honours record in 1975 and Love and War to the 1974 Hobart Handicap win. The founding generation was gone. Then in 2003, after 57 continuous years of operation, the Halvorsen Cruiser hire fleet at Bobbin Head was retired, not evicted, not repossessed, not seized, retired, rising public liability insurance premiums. Environmental protection pressure on Cowan Creek, a market that had moved on from the wooden family holiday to the Fibreglass day charter, and the passing of the founders who had personally supervised every hull. The small hire boats, the rowing skiffs, the open launches, the aluminium runabouts closed around 2004 to 2005. Then in July 2006, Harvey Halvorsen sold the leasehold at Bobbin Head to Empire Marinas director Darren Vaux, a private commercial sale, for an undisclosed sum. The redevelopment was extensive, 200 deep-water berths, award-winning marina, reduced footprint from 13 hectares to under 5, 5 gold anchor platinum status, multiple Marina of the Year awards, a restaurant, a ship's chandlery, deep-water fueling, 24-hour on-site security. Here's the honest thing. The Halvorsen family walked away. Nobody made them. No government eviction, no forced non-renewal, no hostile takeover, no Iacocca, no Kubo, no Michael Polk, no boardroom in Wichita, Kansas. The economics had walked away in 1963 when the Bertram 31 debuted at the New York Coliseum for $15,900. It just took 43 more years for the family to accept the departure. Harvey Halvorsen died in March 2021. He had been the last member of the family to run a Halvorsen boatshed in Australia, the third-generation shipwright who signed the sale papers in July 2006. With his death, the family's day-to-day connection to the Australian wooden boat trade came to an end. Chapter 11. The Wooden Boats Still Sail. 2025. Darling Harbour, Sydney. The Australian National Maritime Museum's Centenary Flotilla. 16 Halvorsen vessels tied up on the Heritage Pontoon. Solvay, Anitra V Silver Cloud, Enterprise, Kalinda, MV Kangaroo, Freya herself. 100 years since Lars Halvorsen rented that first boatshed at Drumuna in February 1925. MV Kangaroo, job number 1127, launched November 1958, still chartering Sydney Harbour weddings and corporate events. The last of the original Bobbin Head hire fleet, 67 years old. Solveig, Triagva's 1950 design, completed the 2021 Sydney to Hobart, 71 years after her first launch. Anitra Fof, 1956, still races out of Middle Harbour, Norla, 1960, Hobart-based. Freya herself, 62 years old, still afloat in Sydney. 3 consecutive Hobart wins on her plaque and none since. The Halvorsen Club, the Active Owners Association, runs regular flotillas up the Hawkesbury. The Australian National Maritime Museum houses the Halvorsen Family Archive, donated in 2002. Photographs, design drawings, personal papers, tools. The ANMM's exhibition. Dreamboats and Workboats, the Halvorsen story, ran across 2004 and 2005. Randy Svensson, Lars's granddaughter, published the definitive family history. Wooden Boats, Iron Men, the Halvorsen story, with Holstead Press in 2004. Every Halvorsen boat on the Australian Register of Historic Vessels is documented. The Ryde site, Waterview Street, Putney, is being redeveloped as Putney Wharf, a $300 million residential development. The heritage-listed boatshed, State Environmental Planning Policy. State Heritage Item Number 68, the Naval Refit Centre, is being restored as part of the development alongside the apartment towers. The Bobbin Head boatshed, built 1937, still stands. Fire damaged in July 2012. Repaired. Now the hardstand of Empire, Marina Bobbin Head. 200 deep water berths, where the wooden hire cruisers used to moor. Where the Halvorsen's own office once was, there is now a marina reception desk. Where Harold Halvorsen once walked the slipway in his 90th year, there is now a valet parking bay. Where 6 cousins used to jump off the wooden decks into Cowan Creek, there are now day charter yachts painted white. No plaque for Lars Halvorsen, no plaque for the 11 Fairmiles, no plaque for the Hollywood Fleet, no plaque for Steady Hour and Sea Mist, and the depth charge dropped in Taylor's Bay on the 1st of June 1942. No plaque for Freya's 3 consecutive Sydney to Hobarts. No plaque for the 1,299 boats. But every Sunday on the Parramatta River, on the Hawkesbury, on Pittwater and Broken Bay and Cowan Creek, the wooden Halvorsens are still sailing. 67-year-old Kangaroo, 75-year-old Solveig, 62-year-old Freya. Oregon planking, spotted gum below the waterline, silky teak varnish catching the afternoon sun. The Empire is silent. The boats are not. Lesson 1. Chemistry beats craft. For 51 years, from Lars's 1925 arrival in Drummoyne to Emma's launch at Ryde, on the 20th of June, 1976, Halvorsen built boats the same way. Oregon above the waterline, spotted gum below, copper rivets, Queensland maple frames, teak trim, French polished mahogany interiors, 6 months of hand labour per 36-footer, 40 tradesmen working the season, 2,000 board feet of imported Oregon per hull. It was the same tradition Halvor Andersen had taught his son Lars in Helle, near Arendal, in southern Norway. Generations of continuous craft, unbroken, across the North Sea, Cape Town and Sydney Harbour. Then, in February 1961, on a display floor at the New York Coliseum, an American company laid the first Bertram 31 fiberglass hull down at a base price of $15,900, moulded, not planked. A fraction of the labour. Same price, no rot, no annual paint job, no French polishing. The end was there in the launch photograph. The end was in the chemistry. Craft cannot beat chemistry. Not on cost, not on labour, not on maintenance, not on the balance sheet of any family firm anywhere. The Halvorsens saw it. They adopted it. They just had to move to Hong Kong to do it profitably. Nobody killed the wooden Halvorsen. The material killed it. Lesson 2. Manufacturing sovereignty is also about skill. The Halvorsen shipwright, the Norwegian-trained, Sydney-apprenticed, Ryde-graduated master craftsman, is now extinct in Australia. Trevor Garland was one of the last, apprentice from age 14, foreman on Gretel, third helmsman on the Fraser Triple, later general manager of HMG, later still the manager of Empire Marina Bobbin Head, died 2007, Trygve Halvorsen's eulogy, verbatim. Trevor was like one of the family to us. He was with us from apprenticeship for most of his working life. The 350 tradesmen at Ryde in 1944, the Fairmiles builders, the caulkers, the joiners, the French polishers, the double diagonal planking specialists retired, died, or were displaced by fibreglass. Australia today does not have the skill base to build another 11 Fairmiles motor launches. The trades are gone. The apprentices are gone. The Naval Refit Centre at Ryde, the RAN's own successor to Halvorsen, was itself closed and mothballed. The skill did not migrate to Hong Kong with Harvey and Trygve in 1975. It stayed at Ryde, and it died there. When we talk about manufacturing sovereignty in Australia, we usually mean factories, Chrysler, Malleys, Nilex, but it also means shipwrights, toolmakers, coppersmiths, skilled hands, and once the wooden boat industry closed, the hands closed with it. There is no reopening a hand. There is no reapprenticing a dead trade. An 18-year-old apprentice at Ryde in 1944 could plank a Fairmiles hull by 1947. An 18-year-old today can watch YouTube videos of shipwrights from the archive footage. Neither has any pathway to the trade itself. The trade is gone. Australia's naval shipbuilding today is steel and aluminium and carbon fibre. Managed by BAE Systems and Austal and ASC, not by families named Halvorsen. Lesson 3. The boats outlived the empire, 1925 to 1980. 55 years of continuous Australian production. 1,299 hulls launched. 11 Fairmiles that hunted Japanese submarines from Darwin to the Coral Sea. 8 polished Channel patrol boats that sank a Japanese midget submarine in Taylor's Bay on the night of the 1st of June, 1942. A yacht called Freya that won 3 consecutive Sydney to Hobarts on handicap and set a record still unmatched Guinness Summit 62 years later. A yard at Ryde that Australia's first America's Cup Challenger sailed from off Newport under President Kennedy's watch. And a hire fleet at Bobbin Head that carried Sydney families up the Hawkesbury, between 1946 and 2003. And the empire is gone. Lars died in 1936, Harold in 2000, Carl in 2014, Trygve in 2014, Magnus in 2015. The Ryde yard closed in 1980. Bobbin Head sold in July 2006. But the boats, the actual wooden boats, the Oregon and spotted gumboats, the boats Lars and Harold and Trygve and Trevor Garland personally put their hands on, are still sailing. Kangaroo is 67. Solvay is 75. Freya is 62. The 2021 Sydney to Hobart included Solvay. The 2025 Centenary Flotilla included 16 Halvorsens on the Heritage Pontoon at Darling Harbour. Every Sunday, every summer weekend, they still leave the moorings and head up the Hawkesbury. 6 cousins on the aft deck, the father at the wooden wheel, the mother in the teak galley. 7 knots up towards Barara waters. The empire died. The boats did not. That is the real inheritance. And it is not a small one. 1,299 boats. Lars Halvorsen never insured his last one, and every single one of the others still floats.